So today we're going to be doing a basic guide for setting up oVirt on a single node. So for the server we're going to be using today is that little Dell 1U right there. It's a Dell 1U, it's a single E5450 with 8 gigs of DDR2 fully buffered RAM I had laying around. Now, okay, so we're going to be installing the system with CentOS 7 because that's the OS I found to work best with oVirt, the hypervisor. This will essentially give you a web interface that lets you easily run VMs on it, access it from any system with a web browser on your local network or anywhere if you set it up that way. And it just lets you do GPU pass-through if your stuff supports it. You can run as many VMs as you want. You can add it to a cluster later on if you want to. But we're going to just be doing a very basic single node setup to get you started. So first thing we have to do is actually just install CentOS, which is the base OS it's going to be the oVirt hypervisor will be installed on top of. Now, this system, you can install it via USB stick, or you can do PXE network install, which I might do a guide on later, but we're just going to install it off the network. And I'll show you once you get into the installer. It's going to be the same if you install it from the network or on your USB stick. Just go to CentOS and download the latest CentOS 7 ISO image, and it'll work perfectly fine. And here we go. We are now booting the installer and loading the virtual machine, the initial RAM images into RAM. So here we are in the installer. Basically, just hit continue. If English is your language. Automatic partitioning, so here's the drive we're going to use. It already has some junk on it. We select the drive, hit done. It's going to tell us we have partitions on it. We can tell it to delete it if we don't care about the data. Everything else looks good. It's a minimal install, network set up properly. If you don't have the network, just turn it on. You also have to set a password for the root user. We don't need to set up another user right now, but you can if you'd like. Now we have to do some very basic configuration on the physical system, but we can do it all remotely. We have to log in with root. Then we're going to type in our password that we created. And then once the password's typed in, we gotta do NMTUI, Network Manager Text User Interface. Edit a connection. We want to do whatever connection we're plugged into. That's the top one in this system. You can check it, but we're gonna just do this. Now, we want to change the automatic to a manual configuration. Show addresses. Add an address. 192.168.1. We're gonna do 27 in this case. Gateway, this is your router, normally 192.168. You also have to put a /24 in here if you have a 255.255.255.0 net mask, which most people do. 192.168.1.1 DNS servers, 192.168.1.1. For now, this is we're gonna just use our router as a DNS server. For this, we're going to also have automatically connect and available to all users, and that should be good for now. And then we can quit out of this. And then in order to restart the network to apply the new IP address, system control restart network. Right here. System control, not just system. Okay, that's going to restart the network. We can check the network with IP space ADDR. That will list the network adapter right here, and we can see it's on the correct one. So if we want to just test it, we can do ping google.com. And we can see it is finding the DNS and working correctly. So now we can go on another system and use SSH and connect to that IP address to have full remote management control over this system. Let's go hop onto the computer and set up oVirt. Okay, so now we're going to SSH into it. We're going to use PuTTY for this system. PuTTY is a SSH client for Windows. It's going to say the key isn't perfect, but I trust these systems. They're fresh installs. Log in using the same username and password. Now we have to set a few things. Basic Linux stuff. Hostname control. Set hostname. We are going to use random server 6.example.com for this system. And then we are going to do a date, make sure the date and time is set correctly, which it is. We are going to now, what are some other basic things? Yum update. You should just do this, make sure it's running the newest version, and then we're going to reboot to update the kernel, because you have to reboot to update the kernel. You can add a -y if you want to have it automatically say yes, because you're going to see a prompt here if you want to download a ton of stuff, because it's probably going to be like 100 megs of updates. Now that the system's been fully updated, we are going to get oVirt. So go to their website, oVirt.org. Now we go to the install image. We are going to copy and paste this in here. And it's going to install the oVirt repository, which lets you download all the other oVirt packages. So we can now go yum install oVirt engine. This is the engine that manages everything. You have to have this engine to run it, and there's two ways to do it. You either install it on a bare metal server like I'm doing right now, or on a VM that's kind of pre-configured for this. VM's a bit more complicated, so we're going to just do the simplest single system thing. There's a ton of stuff it has to install. It says it's going to use over a gigabyte install. It takes a while. Now that oVirt's installed, we can do engine setup. This is what's going to be used to configure the engine. It's going to go check your system for all the different things after you install it, just to make sure it's set up correctly. And then, fairly soon, it's going to say configure the engine on this host. That's exactly what you want to do. So yes. Configure image IO proxy. Yes. By default. You want that. WebSocket proxy. Yes. Data warehouse. Yes by default. VM console. Yes. Just leave those all at default for now. You can, if it's the default one that's checked, it will, so that's the fully qualified domain server, so BrandonServer6.example.com, that's what we're going to leave it at. Do you want to configure the firewall? That's normally a good idea. It's a local. We configure the data warehouse, gives you a ton of pretty graphs and stuff. Would you like it to automatically create a warehouse, a database for that? Yes. The engine database is going to be local. Everything's going to be local. It's going to be, would you like to set up to automatically configure? I'm going to set that to automatic too. It's creating the database. Now we're going to enter the password, so we're going to use the same password that we used earlier. This is going to be an admin password. I did type in a weak password. Application mode will be both, because it will use, it's for Gluster storage. It's fine, you don't have to touch it. No, by default. Most of these can be just left by default. Do you want to wish the application page? This will make it the default page of your web server. If this system also is a web server, you want to set this to no, but by default, just make it yes. Do you want this to automatically configure to perform setup to, it's going to use an SSL certificate. It's going to make one, and it's not going to be a valid one according to most, but you can have it manually do it. Otherwise, you can provide your own certificate if you have your own signing stuff. Do you want to configure it or not? We're going to set up their shares now. We are going to do a basic sampling. You don't need more. And there you go. It's going to go configure it, and this will take a minute or two for it to configure the thing. And then we can do all the management in a browser. So in order to access it, you have to type in the fully qualified domain name, so BrandonServer6.example.com. If you don't, it's going to complain about an error. There is a certificate problem, so just tell it to ignore it. And then we're going to go to admin portal. This takes a minute on these slow systems. If you can't access it via DNS and only can access it via IP, you can add a entry to your host file in your operating system, or you can put it in a static entry in your DNS configuration. We're going to add the username and password, logged in. Also, if you can't access it, try turning off the firewall on the system. Sometimes that can screw stuff up. So now we're in, it's loading. It can take a minute, especially since this is a slower system here. And we are in. So it has the default data center, which we are going to remove because we want to make our own. Okay. I'm going to say new data center. We're going to call it oVirt test. We're going to change storage to local. Everything else you can leave the same for now if you just want a basic system. Now you need to configure a cluster. You have data centers which have clusters. oVirt test. Okay, so here's a few more things. This is the management network. Don't touch that. Not like there's any other option. Now I have to configure the CPU architecture and type. PowerPC or x86. It's x86. Configure it to whatever your CPU is. If you don't know, just leave it as an old CPU. Some of them do need to have the some newer OSs need it, such as I think Windows 8 and newer need the Halium. Other than that, you don't really have to touch anything in here. scheduling policy, I normally, or optimization, I change it to desktop load so I can run more VMs on systems without a ton of RAM. Now we have to configure a host. I'm gonna call this, we're gonna make this its own host. So we're gonna call it Brandon server. We're adding itself to the port pool. You don't have to put, you can call this whatever you want. I just normally call it the same thing as its thing, and then we set the password to whatever you set the root password to. You don't really have to touch anything else here. If you want to do pass-through of a device, you have to check this option. Other than that, you don't have to touch anything. No, there is one thing you have to touch. Under General, if you're running it on the same thing, you have to uncheck the automatically configure the firewall, because it configures the firewall different than the engine does. So it won't work, and it'll just fail. So it's going to complain you haven't configured power management. You can configure power management if it's a supported system, but it will, but you have to, don't do it on a system that you're hosting it from, because if it wants to reboot it, it's going to force reboot itself, and it's going to have issues. Now it's going to be setting up all the packages on here. It has about 200 packages that to install. It's going to look at the system, see what it is, and now it goes through the stage of package installation. Has to download them and install them just like we had to download and install the thing. It's using yum in CentOS. Now that the host is set up under hosts, we can see it, it's ready to be used. We have to set up the storage. So new domain, it's on a local storage, so we're going to say slash, I made a directory slash oVirt slash data. You have to make it on here using make dir, mk dir, make directory. And you also have to change permissions to give read-write access to the oVirt people. You can also just change it to 777. For basic install, that's going to be fine. We're going to add it now. And it will take a second or two to initialize, but it should be ready to use quite soon. And do it. The other image here, which is pre-made, says it's the oVirt image repository. This lets you just have pre-made images for quite a few versions of OSs. Mostly Linux ones, also do a quick one. So now we can. So now we have to make another domain. We have to make the storage here. So we're going to do mkdir slash oVirt slash ISO, and we're going to change the directory 777 for ISO. There is proper ways to do it, but that's the easy way. I'm going to change the data one to an ISO. I'm going to call it an ISO. You can call it whatever you want. Storage type, I'm going to change this to local on host, and then go slash ovirt slash ISO. The ISO one is where it's going to store all the install ISOs for every single one. This is going to take yet another minute to install on here. So now both of the data and the ISO have been added. You can see here is the oVirt image repository. And there's quite a few. There's Ubuntu, there's CentOS. You can import any of these that you want. I've already imported a few. If you want to import another domain, you have to copy it to the server. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to just import it from a web browser, which is kind of annoying. So the easy way to do that, depending on how you want to do it, if you want to run a different OS, you have to do yum install, which installs a package, -y will just answer yes to every question. And then it is Samba. And that will install the Samba server. I think it's Samba. Yeah, it's Samba. And now it's going to install Samba, which is the CIFS file server. And it's almost done. And then in order to edit it, it can get kind of pissy about stuff. But the easy way to do it, it's going to complain about the firewall. We're going to turn that off. So system control, stop, IP tables. It uses IP tables by default. You also want to do, we're going to do SE Linux, and then we also have to do the, so that's VI, which is your text editor. You can also use nano, /etc/sm /samba/smb.conf. Go to the bottom, and then we're going to add another shell. So we're going to call it ISO. So you have, call it whatever you want. This has to be unique. Then we can do path equals slash oVirt slash ISO. Writable equals yes. I don't think you need this though. And that should be it. We can do, and then we can do a user add Brandon. No, it would be SMB password dash A, which means add a user Brandon. You the Samba passwords are different than your standard Unix passwords or system passwords, which is kind of annoying. The other thing you have to do is, now that you've configured your Samba share, you can set it up in Windows by going map network drive / / 2 backslashes 192.168.1.27, whatever it is, and then you can set it to whatever your share name is. Use different credentials, and you can just add it. So right now to show this, and these are the folders it uses. Anything you drag in here now will be an image. So I have a ton of OSs. So for example, if I want to put a, let's say I'm going to chuck a Linux Mint 18 in here and copy this in. Doesn't have permission. I need to change that. We need mod-r7777 NT oVirt. This is going to recursively change our permission, so it changes it to all permissions down. I'm used to changing them out. So that's oVirt slash ISO. So to change every permission, and it should work now. Yeah, it does. And it's copying it. It's about 1.5 gigs. Copies fairly fast, over a gigabit. And then if I want to, for example, here's what you have to do. So for Windows, you can copy any standard Windows ISO. So I have a pile of here. This is a Windows 7 Pro, 64-bit. One of these is 64. The other one is. There's a Windows 7 Pro 64-bit ISO I can also copy to it. The other thing with Windows is because this is a Linux virtual machine, Windows does not have drivers for it built in. So you have to get the drivers. You can get them by going, I'll put the link in the description, virtio drivers. Here you go. Someone has an ISO. No, this is, here, there's a Fedora has a download link here. And then down here you want the stable virtwin floppy drive. We're gonna just use the Windows ISO right here. This guy. You can download it and save it. I think I also have a copy. You have to also download, put this guy in your images folder just with all the other ones. So if I go, I think I have a copy of it in my images folder that I'm gonna put in there off camera. And then we're going to show you how to set up the VM. So now we have all the images and stuff ready, so let's set up a few virtual machines. Go to the virtual machines tab. It'll show you my main one. You can go new VM. We're going to go through all the basic options you have to touch. Now it's going to be a little bit slow right now on this system. Faster system will do so much faster. So we're going to call this one Windows, let's do Linux Mint first. You're going to need a GUID here, which is kind of annoying about it. The easiest way I've noticed is there's a website called guidgin.com. There's also an executable you can run in Windows, and I think most OSs, but web browser just is normally easy. Copy and paste that in. It has to be unique, but the chances of getting the same GUID is very low. Description and comment you can leave blank for now. Instance images. This is the boot drive of your thing. It is a thin template, so that means if you make a 50 gig image and store 1 gig of data on it, it's going to use 1 gig on the drive, not 50. Shows you how much you have available. So we're going to make a 20 gig drive right now. We're going to hit OK. You don't have to touch anything else here. You can change how the drive works and stuff like that, but by default, it works fine. Now you need to pick a virtual NIC profile. This is the network card. By default, just use the openvirt management one. Works fine. Up here, you can see the cluster. If you have multiple clusters, you can select it. Right now, we have one cluster, so it's fine. OS, by default, it will change which icon you have. It doesn't really change much else, so don't worry about it. Template is blank. Template, you can set templates. I'll do that in the more advanced one. Custom instance type is how much it uses. We'll show you how to do that more. And optimized for is kind of how it manages resources and how much it overdoes that. So the other thing you might want to touch is system. So virtual CPUs, you can run that up to the number of CPUs your system has, which is 4. Memory size is how much RAM, so I'm going to do 2048 on here. Now, this has a virtual, it has a memory balloon device, so that means it's only going to use 1 gig of RAM guaranteed, but if it needs it, it'll give it up to 2. So if your system's using 1.5 gigs, it's only going to use 1.5 gigs on the host. You have an advanced parameters here, which lets you choose how many sockets, cores, and threads. By default, don't worry about it. It doesn't affect performance. I've tested it unless you're running Windows, where you have to lower the amount of sockets because they limit you how many sockets you can use. Other than that, you don't have to touch anything. And it will take a minute or two to create it. And it's here. In order to run it for the first time, you say run once. And you'll get a little pop-up window about how you want to install it. By default, it just boots to the internal hard drive. But by boot options, if you don't touch anything right now, it'll boot to the network if you have a PXE network device. Otherwise, you can click on Attach CD. You might want to refresh it if your CDs or ISOs don't show up. This searches in all your ISO libraries. And we're going to click on Linux Mint. And now, it will download and run. And now it's booting up. So now you want to access it. There's a few ways. There's a little console button, and how you can access it, and also a console options. There's a few ways to do it. There's 3 main protocols. You have Spice, VNC, and Remote Desktop. You have to set this in the thing when it's not running. And you have the native client and the browser client, which I can't get the browser client to work for the life of me. The best thing I've seen is you can click on this console client resources. You get a pop-up window. And you can click the Virt Manager download, which should go to this site, right? Computer? Yeah, there it goes. And if you want to download it, you can install it in your Linux distros by adding this from your package manager. Most of them come from the package manager. You can compile it from source if you want to do that. Or I think they have a Windows download. Not Virt Manager, you want Virt Viewer here. They have a Windows binary right here if you are running Windows. I think they also have a Mac OS X version, but I haven't gotten it to work very well. If you're running Firefox, you can very easily say every time it just always runs it with the program, so you don't have to download it and then open it. So now on my system it's set up, it just opens it like this. And it's currently running Linux Mint. And it's smart, so if for example, I don't have to hit any key in Linux Mint or any Linux distro most of the time. And it says it doesn't have hardware rendering because it's running a virtualized graphics card, but if I want, I can open up the installer, and I can install the OS if I'd like. So it's English, I can hit continue. Let's go over how I install a version of Windows. I'm going to be using Windows 7 Pro for testing right now, and showing how this works. But it'll be virtually the same if I'm running any version of Windows 7 or newer. XP is a little bit of a pain to get with drivers. I'm gonna go Windows 7 Pro, generate a new GUID. This takes a sec. Switch over to the tabs here, paste it in. Don't have to set this. We're gonna create a 30 gigabyte image to install it on because Windows is fairly big OS-wise. Now you may have noticed I made a 30 gig image and a 20 gig image on a 50 gig drive. It's fine because of how they're thin images, they're not full size. You can make them full size, but there's really no reason to. Make sure to give it a network card, otherwise you can't connect it to net. System. This is being a little bit slow. Okay, we're going to give it 4 gigs RAM because Windows 7 is a bit beefier of a system. When it comes to RAM usage, if I look at like top now, we see, other than a fairly hard to use thing, we don't have much free RAM of course, but okay, memory. Okay, so we have 8 gigs RAM on the system, of which 100 megs are free, which seems a little bit weird, but it's being used for cache, so we're using about 3 gigs total. It'll be fine. Also, with virtual CPUs, if you want to have more than 2, you have to make sure you tell it that you want 4 virtual CPUs. it'll update this. Make sure to tell it that you want 4 cores, not 4 sockets. Otherwise, it's going to show up as having 4 CPUs, but you can only use one of them. That's all we need for now. When it comes to memory, you probably want to leave at least about 1 to 2 gigs for the host, preferably more depending on what your setup is. So now Windows 7 Pro. And we can say run once. And it's going to start this again, same message. And you can go boot options, attach CD, and it's going to attach the Windows 7 boot drive, because that's what's on the top of the list. And it should boot right up. Now if we look at the virtual machine viewer, we can see we're installing Linux Mint on here just fine. We use the default install options, and it'll work perfectly fine. Now Windows 7 is starting right up. And console is here. And it's going to load files and start it just like any other OS would. And it'll take a moment to boot. And because of how drivers work in Windows, you have to click in it and then hit Shift F12 to exit. I think you could change that key, I don't know. Next, install. It's going to say setup is starting. The normal accept the terms of license, hit next, custom install, and there's no drives. That's because you need a driver to use the drives. So here's what you're going to do. Switch to here, change CD. Now we're going to add the driver CD, so the VirtIO Windows CDs. Come on. And now we have the VirtIO. So you want to go under load driver. We're going to go browse. And then we can go under VirtIO now. VirtIO store. Pick whichever version of Windows you're running. And then the 64-bit for that. And hit install driver. Now that it's doing this, you can normally switch to CD right back. CD has been switched back now. We can now go advanced drive options, new, apply, okay. And it'll take a second, and then now that's our main drive, we can hit next, and it's going to install Windows just like we normally would. Let's get a quick look back at our Linux Mint system. You have to hit Shift F12 to get out. And should be working fine. And it looks like it's trying to format the drive right now. I know exactly what it's doing. It's installing it seems like. So now it's been installed, but you notice there's no network drivers. And the easy way is to open up, install stuff, open up Device Manager. Then go into here. I then say change CD. There's currently no CD in it because it rebooted. Put the VirtIO CD in. And it's going to get to work on that. Then in here, device. The lazy way is to open up the run command and go ngmt.msc. And we're in. It should be. The storage is pretty slow on this server. I also have another VM running and it just doesn't seem to be happy. So if you look on the dashboard, it actually will show us the usage, how I'm using way too much RAM for this system. So you can see it shows you RAM usage as a graph, CPU usage as a graph, which is low. I'm using way too much RAM. How much storage I'm using in TB. It's very little on here. It's normally designed for bigger storage users. Now back on here, we see the Ethernet controller, which has no driver. You can go right click, update driver software, and we can say browse my computer locally. By default, it's a CD, so it'll be d:// next, and it's going to search it for software. It's going to find it. It's going to ask you if you want to install it, and you say yes. And you just do that for the 4 different devices that you have on the system. Okay, here we go. We found it. Always trust it. Red Hat's fairly trusted. This is originally Red Hat software, which has been rebranded for CentOS and oVirt. It's KVM, and it does it. And essentially, you just do the same thing for all of them. So now every OS has been finished installing. So you can see here's our Windows 7 install right here, and it's opening up the console. And if you want to change desktop resolution, you can change it like you can on any other system. If you look in Task Manager, the storage here is fairly slow, so that's why it feels so sluggish. If you open up Task Manager, you can see all the cores, you can see all 4 gigs of RAM. It's probably working on Windows updates right now. Of course it is. You can change the screen resolution to be higher if you want, because I think this is like 800 by 600 or 480 by 640 is horribly small. And this guy's been running for 2 days, so it's a stable system. It works fine. It will run faster if you give it a faster system, and I definitely recommend much more than 8 gigs of RAM if you can. Performance-wise, CPU-wise, is quite good, so I can go fire up something like Cinebench if you want to see that, so you can see how the performance is. You can see we have the 30GB drive. And we see in this VM, performance is about right. We get 178 CV, which feels about right on the CPU running on a virtual machine. Shut it down and use it on any other system. I do have better experiences on faster systems, as I've probably said a lot before. And it does connect to the network like any other device on the network. It doesn't go through a virtual NAT system like that. You can set that up if you have a second NIC on the system and have a VM that runs as a router. And if you have multiple systems, you can connect that router VM to it, so you have one network card on a router. But I'm going to talk about more of that advanced stuff here. So those are all the basics. You could turn them on and off. There's a right-click menu. So if I want to turn on my Linux VM, for example, I can turn it on here. I'm going to view CPU usage in a little graph. In the dashboard, it'll show me how much for the host, the CPU usage, the memory usage, how much storage is used, all as a little graph. If I have a ton of clusters and a ton of storage, it'll show me all of those. So that's basically it. Yeah, so that's all the basics of oVirt. I'm going to do a video explaining the more complex things about oVirt later on, and how the more advanced things you can do, like network. You can add like more users. You can have clusters. I'll do a video explaining all that. But for now, thanks for watching this basic oVirt video, and I hope that this helps.